Hey, on today's episode, I know there's a lot of shows out there that talk about marketing your podcast, but today I'm going to give you the 7 worst ways that you can market an audio podcast. Let's jump in.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing? Hey, how is that podcast of yours coming along? Happy podcasting. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You know, you can find out every single thing about that show on my little website, which I built at chrisandchristineshow.com. There's a link to it in the show notes of this episode today. But here we are talking about podcasting, and more particular, how about your podcast? How is that thing coming along? Hey, if you have a show and you want to share it with me, please do. You can email me at podtasticaudio@gmail.com. I would love to check out your show. And if you have any questions about your show, how to make it better and make it sound better, well, maybe I can help you out. And that's what Podtastic Audio is all about. You know, there's probably, I don't even know how many podcasts about podcasting that are actually out there in the world. Probably thousands of them. I mean, I subscribe to a good handful of them, probably the bigger ones. I'm sure there's a bunch out there. There's probably one that opens up every other day. There's a new, podcast about podcasting. Or even if you go to YouTube, there are YouTube videos about podcasting or how to podcast or how to make your show bigger and better and all that great, wonderful stuff. But one thing I did notice about a lot of these quote unquote podcasts about podcasting is that they really are not about podcasting. They're more focused on the marketing of podcasting. Now, some of these podcasts that focus on the marketing side of podcasting, they will actually come up front and say, hey, our show is about marketing your podcast, growing your podcast, about getting more downloads and more plays. But a lot of these shows, they focus on all these strategies on how to physically market your show, get it out there, get more downloads, get more plays, more listens, and so on and so forth. Now, if you think of your podcast as a bucket that you're filling full of water, now the water is the listeners pouring into your show. Now, they've got great ways on how to get people to listen to your show, more water getting poured into that bucket. But if your bucket is full of holes on the very bottom of the bucket, all the water is just going to pour right out. You got them coming in, but if they're leaving out the back door or at the bottom of the bucket in this example here, then what's the point? And I know a lot of shows, you'll listen to them and you wonder, how does that show have 10,000 downloads an episode? How is it even possible? Because you listen to the show and first thing you're hit in the face with 4 minutes of advertisements, ads of things that you could care less about. Then when the host finally gets on the show, they immediately go into a way that you can support them for their show. Oh, please go to our Patreon and be a subscriber on our Patreon page right now. It helps us keep the show going, even though the show is probably hosted on a free hosting provider like Spotify for podcasters, and the entire show was recorded in their bedroom on their laptop, which they already have. So the total investment is zero, and yet you want me to donate to your Patreon page? Now, keep in mind, this is at the very, very beginning of the episode, and you should assume that every listener that pushes play on your podcast, just assume that this is their very first time pressing play on an episode of yours. It'd be like you went to a restaurant and before you even ordered any food, before you even get a chance to look at the menu or even decide if you're even hungry, the waiter comes by and says, hey, we need a tip right now. And you're like, what? What for? You haven't given me anything yet. Why would I tip you? Usually you get a tip after you've done a service. So when it comes to a podcast, do not be asking for things before you delivered any value to anybody. So yes, I agree that marketing is very, very important for your podcast. But instead of spending 95% of your energy and time on marketing your show and spending only 5% on creating it, why not spend 95% on creating an amazing show and then 5% on marketing? I'm just saying, you can't market a turd. You have to have a good show to market in the first place. And I'm sure your mom said it was great, and your cousin said it was great, and your coworker even said it was fantastic. But you really got to get at least 5, maybe 10 people that don't know each other to listen to your show and give you a honest feedback, honest review of that show, what they liked, what they didn't like. Now, and a very easy way to do this is to create a survey through Google. Google's got a free platform in the whole Google ecosystem where you can create a free survey for your audience to fill out or pass it out to people. Maybe you can send a link to an episode and see if they press play and see if they actually enjoyed the episode, what worked and what didn't work. Now, I think when people actually push out surveys to people to say, hey, check out my show, let me know what you think, they really want them to say, it's great, you did a great job, keep it up, it's amazing, it was a great show. That's what everybody wants to hear, because nobody wants to hear criticism. We don't want to hear our show is horrible. Nobody wants to hear that. Even if you ask for it, and you say, hey, please give me an honest feedback, an honest review. I don't think people actually want that. They don't mean that. They just want to know that it's okay and everything's great. It's all sunshine, roses, and ponies. It's all amazing. But unfortunately, that's not how the real world works. We don't all just get automatic trophies. We don't always automatically rise to the top of the charts, even though you see shows that shouldn't be at the top of the charts. They are in the top 100, and you're like, how is that even possible? Well, it takes money, and these bigger shows have massive budgets where they can pay to promote their show. And a lot of these marketing shows about podcasting, they even mention this, is that there are lots of services out there where you can pay to advertise your podcast. You can pay for it on social media. You can pay for it with banner ads in different podcast media player apps. You can pay to physically promote your podcast. But it would be helpful if you had a good show to promote. You know, I think in the age we live in today, as I record this podcast, it is extremely easy to create a podcast, an audio podcast, or even a video YouTube thing. You use your iPhone for that if you really wanted to. But the last episode I did, the last bonus episode I just did, I recorded the entire thing sitting at my laptop in a hotel room with no other gear and no other equipment, just the computer by itself. I recorded a show and I ran it through some editing tools, and I did my best with what I had just on the laptop to create an amazing sounding podcast virtually with just the laptop microphone. So you can make a show that sounds fairly decent with limited gear or absolutely no gear at all. So I think that helps people jump into podcasting. They think, well, I've already made this show. It sounds great because I have all these great, wonderful, AI tools that are out there, like the script and podcast enhanced through Adobe, things like that, to make it sound phenomenal, or at least fairly well. I know it's not going to sound as great as, an SM7B microphone plugged into a mixer and a console and a radio station compressor. It's not going to sound like that, but it's going to sound a lot better than it used to be, say, 5 years ago, when people tried to record a podcast with earbuds plugged into their iPhone years and years ago and releasing only that plain audio. Today, we can take that same audio, run it through a lot of effects, and make it sound fairly decent. Now, like I said, it's not going to be the best, but it's going to be a hell of a lot better than it used to be. So because of that easy entry level to get into podcasting and to make a show, so now people want to focus on, how do I make this thing great? How do I grow this thing? How do I make it amazing? I want to share it out to the world. Everybody in the world that likes this particular topic needs to listen to my show. They have to listen to my show because it's amazing. And I'm not satisfied unless I hit 10,000 downloads per episode, per week, per show, yada, 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 yada. Now, I know it can be very deflating when a lot of other podcasters that are out there will share, quote unquote, their stats out to the world. And they say, look, I hit my first 10 million downloads, or I've hit 1 million downloads on this episode, and so on and so forth. Listen, a lot of shows actually lie about their stats to make themselves feel bigger than they really are. It's all a bait and switch. Honestly, people, including myself here, don't get as many download plays as we think we do. So, being that there are a lot of shows out there that tell you exactly the best ways on how to market your podcast, how to get it out there to the masses and grow your audience, today I'm going to flip it on its script and we're going to go just on the opposite direction here. I'm going to give you 7 of the worst ways to market your audio podcast. You know, this actually gets me extremely excited because you always hear of all the best ways to do things, but now we're going to talk about the worst ways to do it. So starting off with number 1, ignoring your target audience. You see, failing to identify and target the appropriate audience for your podcast can be a major marketing mistake. Broadcasting to a demographic that has little interest in your content can result in low engagement and limited growth. Now, if you've ever been on social media like I have, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, whatever, messaging, whatever it is out there, you'll get a podcaster will send you their show and say, hey, please check out my show. Please check it out. And I'm thinking, well, that's a show that I could care less about, like true crime, for example. I'm not a big true crime listener. I mean, if it's some big major story that happened recently in the news, or if it's a local story, I may check that out. But listen, I'm not a big true crime listener. So you're trying to send me a true crime podcast, or even worse, they'll try to send me a sports podcast like the Cleveland Browns podcast. Dude, I'm in San Diego. Do you think I give a crap about the Cleveland Browns? No, I don't. So why would I listen to your show? I'm sorry. I'm not your target audience. Moving on to number 2. Overlooking SEO optimization. Now, for the record, if you do not know what SEO stands for, it stands for search engine optimization. Basically meaning that when you type into Google a topic or niche under a particular category, Google says, hey, you know what? This XYZ podcast, they love to talk about that kind of thing. It's all about their subject matter. Here it is. So neglecting to optimize your podcast episodes for search engines can hinder discoverability. Avoiding relevant keywords, poor episode titles, inadequate show descriptions can make it difficult for potential listeners to even find your content. So, moving on to number 3, inconsistent release schedule. Now, I've been guilty of this because with the Chris and Christine show, we record when we physically can record. Because with our multiple schedules and traveling all around the world, all around Europe, New York, Hawaii, everywhere, and with the wedding business and all those different things, and actually having 3 people, if you think about it, with a guest on the podcast, that's 3 different schedules to manage. It can get tricky making episodes regularly. A haphazard release schedule can lead to frustration among the audience. Inconsistency in publishing episodes may cause listeners to lose interest or forget about your podcast altogether. Consistency is key for building a loyal audience. Now, moving on to number 4, neglecting social media. You see, if you decide to never use social media and think that, like, I'll put my podcast out in the universe, and of course, it's going to be discovered, and of course, it's going to be found. I mean, obviously, right? I mean, that's how it kind of works. Listen, if you never tell anybody of a podcast, how are they even going to know? You see, failing to leverage social media platforms to promote your podcast is a missed opportunity. Social media can be a powerful tool for engaging with your audience, sharing updates, and creating a community around your content. Ignoring these platforms can limit your podcast's potential growth. Okay, and moving on to number 5. Now, this has got to be one of my, if not my personal favorite here, because a lot of shows make this mistake all the time. And that is ignoring audio quality. I see us especially with video shows, with the YouTube video style of a show. I see this all the time. Poor audio quality can be a major turnoff for listeners. Hello, yeah, of course. Neglecting to invest in good equipment or skipping the editing process, like who would even do that? The horror, unbelievable, can result in a subpar listening experience, causing listeners to abandon your podcast before you even get going or even get good. It's hard to catch up to a slow start. The first thing they're going to hear, the very first thing they're going to hear when they press play, it better be an amazing sounding podcast, whether that is video or audio. Make sure it sounds amazing. Now, moving on to number 6, overlooking collaborations and cross promotion. You see, not reaching out to other podcasters for collaborations or cross promotion can limit your exposure. One great way to actually get discovered is to go on other shows and share your content. You see, building relationships within the podcast community can help you tap into a new audience and grow your listener base. Okay, now the final worst way on how to market an audio podcast is lack of engaging content. Now, I know I always say here, audio is amazing, sound matters, be heard. You want your show to sound great, but you really have to have great and engaging content. Content is king after all, they always say. Focusing solely on self-promotion or neglecting the quality and relevance of your content can lead to a decline in listenership. Ensure that your podcast provides value, entertainment, or useful information to keep your audience engaging and coming back for more. Now, that is the 7 worst ways to market your audio podcast, and hopefully you are not doing any of those things. Hey, thank you once again for listening. And if you found any value from listening to this podcast today, maybe you learned something new or something that can benefit your podcast, please share this episode with a friend. Every single podcast player has an app that has a sharing feature built right into it. Just click the little tab and share it with all of your friends that possibly could need to use this information to create a better podcast for them. And I will see you on the next episode.